Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Welcome to this first session of the Observing the Bicentennial seminar proposed by the French School at Athens in this year 2021. My name is Gilles de Rapper. I'm the Director of Modern and Contemporary Studies at the French School. And if we are wearing masks, it's not, of course, for reasons of anonymity, but because we are trying tonight to reconnect with physical encounters. And so the speakers are with me in this room today. And we even have a very small audience in the room, but we are very happy to have it, and they are also happy to meet people again. I will introduce the seminar and our speaker in a moment, but I first give the floor to Véronique Shankowski, Director of the French School at Athens, for a word of welcome. Véronique.
Merci Gilles. Alors bonsoir à tous. Bienvenue dans ce nouveau séminaire webinaire de l'École française d'Athènes. Deux mots simplement pour vous dire toute ma satisfaction de voir ce séminaire démarrer malgré toutes les difficultés. Alors comme nos intervenants ce soir sont anglophones, je vais continuer en anglais. I will switch to English. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the French School of Athens in this webinar, the Observers of the Bicentennial. How did all this start? The French School of Athens wished to support its host country in the anniversary of the 200 years of Greek independence. And during this year, and despite all the disruptions linked to the pandemic, the research community of the French School has been very active in preparing publications, exhibitions, and lectures, both for the public and at an academic level, and also in the next months, and hopefully under better conditions. Some very important initiatives will take place in Greece as well as in France on this topic, which concerns both Philhellenism and friendship between our two countries. So I'm very grateful to all our researchers for their involvement in these topics. I'm also grateful to the Direction of Modern and Contemporary Studies and to Gilles de Rapper, first for the idea of this seminar and for the organization of all this activity, this new seminar that was created especially for the commemorations. As you see, the program of the seminar reflects, I believe, the place of the French school in the social and intellectual debate regarding the Greek Revolution and its anniversary. That is the place of an observer, enthusiastic, but also analytical, and able to put experiences into perspective and to contribute with a critical mind to the construction of knowledge. So I wish good luck to this new seminar. I'm very pleased to see that this seminar takes place despite all the obstacles. Thank you very much to the speakers, and I wish you all a very good evening, even with masks.
Merci Véronique, merci beaucoup. So as you just said, the seminar is one of the French School of Athens contributions to this commemorative year, a contribution that we imagined looking less at the event of 1821 as such, than at the way it is remembered, received, and perceived in contemporary Greece. The bicentennial year has certainly been an opportunity to renew historiography and to shed new light on this complex event whose new dimensions can still be explored. This historiographical renewal, however, is not only of interest to the historian of the period, considered through its challenges, its controversies, and its effects on the discipline and on the society. It is of interest to all of us. And it is in that meaning that the seminar proposes to see the commemorative moment of 2021 as an observatory offering a view on today's Greece. We will have the opportunity through the sessions to make the commemorations an object of study and analysis. But we will begin today with the historiographic renewal I mentioned earlier, with the account of our speaker, Yanni Kotsonis, on the Greek Revolution. Like many of us, Yanni Kotsonis was not, until recently, a specialist in the Greek Revolution. And like some of us, he has become one. And we are, of course, interested in this transformation as well. Yanni Kotsonis is a professor of history and Russian and Slavic studies at New York University. His field of research is the history of Russia and Europe in late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly from the perspective of political economy. He is the author of books on agrarian reform and the history of taxation. He has recently proposed rewriting of the history of the Greek Revolution, taking into account the imperial paradigm he is familiar with, which we'll discuss today. He is the author on the subject of a book published in 2020 in Athens entitled Elleniki Epanastasis και Αυτοκρατορίες. The French school at Athens is publishing a book by him this year entitled The Greek Revolution, and is preparing the publication of The Greek Revolution, A New History in Princeton. And I thank him for accepting the invitation. To respond to him and to launch the discussion, we have asked Ada Dialla to join us. Ada Dialla is a historian, associate professor at the Athens School of Fine Arts. She is also a specialist in Russian history and the scientific leader of a digital program on the revolution and its archives. And I thank her warmly for joining us also. So before giving the floor to Yanni, I would like to remind you that we are in a webinar and you will be able to ask your questions using the usual Zoom tools as the chat, the questions and answer, and the raising hand tools. So Yanni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup pour m'avoir invité, et surtout dans notre condition exceptionnelle. I'm grateful for the invitation, for the opportunity to put forward some ideas that I've been working on and what's already been written and what I'm writing also at the same time. Thank you also to the Fulbright organization for bringing me here, and to Ada, and also the School of Fine Arts, which is also sponsoring my stay here. I did make the transition from Russian history, but I did not make the transition from imperial history. I'm a historian of the Russian Empire, and when I began to consider the Greek Revolution, I happened to be in Paris at the École des Hautes Études. And I just finished another book and I didn't know what to do. But I was happy, and there were lots of archives. And so I started going into the archives and thinking that I'm going to look at the Greek Revolution or Greeks generally and see what I find. And what I found was amazing collections about people who we today consider Greek, but in those days were considered mostly French. Why would they consider Greeks French? Would be the obvious question. Well, the answer is because there's no Greece. What else are they supposed to call them? These are subjects of an empire. And so I began to think that, it makes sense to study a national history, but how do you study a national history before there's a nation state? Well, the answer is you look at the empires. That's where people lived. So the people who become Greeks were subjects of multiple empires. I mean, all of them. I mean, as I said, there's no Greece. Where else are you going to find them? So I began to look at the archives in France, various ones, the archives in Britain, the archives in Switzerland, then of course the archives in Greece. The archives in Greece are collections of mainly personal collections, because they have to be, because there's no state institution to gather Greek archives, because again, there's no such thing as Greece. The one exception is Corfu, which has a very good collection of local material. This is also a question of what do you call this, Greek or do you call it Venetian, right? Or do you call it French because the French then arrived in 1797? Or do you call it Russian because the Russians arrived? Or do you call it British because the British stayed until the 1860s? So always in question is, of course, I think there's such thing as a Greece, but it wasn't clear at the time where Greece was. Was it to be southern Albania? Right? Was it to be all of Macedonia? Was it to be Crete? Was it to be Alexandria, Egypt? Was it to be Sevastopol? And was it supposed to be the Black Sea region, north and south? And who were the Greeks? It was also unclear. So what I began to realize is that these labels, understandings, in other words, of who the Greeks are, were partly imperial creations. It was the empires which arrived in the regions and told the Greeks who they were. Now, this is not exceptional. Every nationality is learned. Every nationality is created. It's not pre-existing, it's not genetic, it's not biological, it's not primordial. So the Greek case is a typical case in that regard. So what I'm going to do now is narrate to you what I saw and how I'm thinking about the Greek Revolution beginning in the late 18th century, and see how the story I'm telling changes if we look through the optic of the empires. Meaning, what did these people learn from the empires? And how did this particular nation come into being and in this form? And why did it take this particular form? And the obvious place to begin is the Ottoman Empire. The Greek Revolution took place in the Ottoman Empire, period. It's an imperial Ottoman event. And it's a curiosity in some regards, because there wasn't much of a national movement in the Ottoman territory until quite late. I'd place it, late 18 teens, early 1820s, during the revolution itself, in other words, as a mass national movement. And to look at, well, how do we understand the presence of the people we had later called Greeks in the Ottoman context? The people we later called Greeks in the Ottoman context were actually called, as we know, Romans, meaning the heirs to the Eastern Roman Empire. There was a term, Grekos, that meant people who were from the West, not from the Greeks from the Ottoman Empire. And more often they would use local designations. I come from Karitan, I come from Crete, I come from Sfakia, I come from Ypiros, as the case may be. And there's a much more common way to identify oneself, with a certain sense of self-understanding as a religious subject as well. So you're a subject of the Sultan, as all of these people are. Remember, so every Greek of the year 1830, with very few exceptions, was born a subject of the Sultan. And what does this mean? Meaning we're studying Ottoman history to a large extent, and we have to take this seriously. This is not a Turkish occupation. Turkish is not a term used at the time. It's an Ottoman period of what would later be Greek history. It has to be taken seriously in that regard. Now, a lot of the experience of the Christians in the Balkans of the Ottoman Empire, a lot of that history is narrated as an occupation, a subjugation, a tyranny, which is usually done with Orientalist colors, which is to say barbaric Turks, even though Turks is not a category, right? Usually what they mean is Muslims. Slaughtering innocent Christians who are not allowed to practice the religion. And I think by now, one thing we've understood with the new historiography is that this is simply untrue. Greeks, meaning Orthodox Christians, practiced the religion. It was a regime of multi-confessionalism. The problem was not at the time whether or not you could freely practice your Christianity or your Catholicism, each of which had its own millet and its own organization, or Judaism, let alone Islam. This was not the issue at all. And in fact, particularly in the elite strata of the notables, there's a lot of cooperation. So the Ottoman regime is administered locally by the Christians as much as the Muslims. They have respect for each other's religions. They're not killing each other. They are killing each other, but not as religions, right? They are engaged, the notables, in this shared project of ruthlessly exploiting the local peasantry, taxing them in new ways and much more deeply than ever before. And it's done in cooperation between what's in the Morea, meaning Peloponnesos, and Rumeli is considered to be the Kotsonis, right, meaning the notables, alongside the Muslim notables who are mainly called Ayans, right? And they work together. The Ayans, particularly down in the south in the Morea, are too few to administer the territory. They depend completely on the Christian notables as well. And what do? They own land, but even more than that, they use tax farming. They have the right to collect taxes. This is what they're all interested in. And they're getting it from the same population, which is basically the Christian peasants. And the exploitation is ruthless. I mean, you can see the figures, particularly if you read works of Martha Pilian. She wrote a dissertation in French, describes very clearly what it is that the peasants are experiencing at this point, which is extreme taxation and extreme poverty and insecurity, meaning the land that they're working is not theirs, it can be taken away. The tax regime can be changed to subject them to ever greater exploitation. And very often the local population, the peasantry, will simply leave. They'll go somewhere else where it seems to be less exploitative. They might go to Anatolia, they might go to Izmir, they might go up to Macedonia, they might go to the islands, en masse. You know, large whole villages disappearing because they can't take it anymore, or they're looking for a different master. So the question then is not this cleavage, this axis of separation, which is the Muslims against the Christians. That's hardly to be seen. I mean, as I said, there is a religious awareness. The Ottoman Empire is organized according to confession, among other things. So religion does matter, but there's no sense of an exclusive religion. There's no sense at the time that only one religion has the right to exist in a territory. But there is violence. And the violence is not what we've usually understood, I think, which is to say the Ottomans / Muslims / Turks persecuting the Christians. But it's not that kind of violence. It's a crisis of the Ottoman Empire more generally, of which the Balkans is a small part, but an important part, as becomes clear. It's a crisis of governance and of unintended decentralization. The Ottoman region had been governed by a system which they basically inherited from the Byzantines, which is to say the bronia. So the bronia is a grant which is given to somebody to collect taxes, and in return they owe service, right? For the Ottomans, this is the Timar system. For the Russians, it's the Pomestye, right? So in all of this region, there's a similar sense of being given a property, but on condition of giving your loyalty and your services to the monarch, right, in return. And this has been a more or less workable system, but it collapses in the 18th century. And as it collapses in the 18th century, the local notables, especially the Muslims, but also the Christians, begin to take this property as their own. What's known in the Morea, in the Peloponnese, it's known as the Tiflik, right? Which exists in different forms in different places, but it basically becomes the hereditary private property of these people, or it can, if left untouched. And they're not giving service in return. So every time the Sultan needs to mobilize forces to fight the Venetians, to fight the Austrians, later to fight the French and the Russians, when they need resources, men, in other words, to fight, and taxes to be paid to pay for whatever military campaign, they can't simply tell them, I as the Sultan instruct you to appear with an army. They have to negotiate with them. It's okay, I'll do it, but I don't have a lot of resources. You have to give me more taxes from another region. You have to give me that territory as well. You have to give me that. If you meet my demands, then I'll bring an army. If you don't, I won't bring an army, right? So rather than obedience, it's negotiation, right? Which makes things difficult. One of the reactions of the Sultan is to figure that the only way they can get these resources back is to take them away from one ayan or Kotzabashir and give it to another, and that person will give me service because he'll be grateful. But how do you get the property? Well, the easy answer is you execute them, kill them. So if you look at the materials in the Greek historiography, you're going to see this Kotzabashir, the Yannis, his head was cut off in the year 1864, the 1764. His grandson was beheaded in the year 1812. And then there's Lodos and all the Kotzabashirs. So as a Greek historiography, this is a Greek experience. But if you read the Albanian historiography or the Ottoman historiography, the same thing is happening to the Albanians and to the Ottomans, Ottoman Muslims. Meaning they too are experiencing the same thing for the same reasons. So it's not a national phenomenon, and it's not particular to the Christians, it's happening across the board. And it is ruthless and bloody. So in order for the Sultan to take away someone else's property, he would mobilize the neighboring Ayan, who would then march on that Ayan, have him executed, send his head to Constantinople, get his reward, and then get a new allotment of a tiflik, or the tax collections, right, of those things. Until this one becomes too complacent and won't give his services, so there's another conspiracy, and they're fighting again with another alliance of local powers, and then they attack that one, have him beheaded, take his properties, and it continues and continues and continues. So it's not a happy place. Now, again, careful here, because in historiography, this is presented as some sort of Oriental barbarism. It's not an old Oriental barbarism, it's an old regime in crisis. That's what it is. It's an old regime in crisis with local inflections. It should be familiar to us, in other words, arbitrariness, inability to collect taxes, inability to finance the state. It should be familiar because that's the prelude to the French Revolution also at the same time. But this is the local reality. So the Kotsabashis do very well, the Ayans do very well. There are certain families which are hereditary and they've been there for about 100 years in these areas. They very often lose their heads, but then their children will inherit the estate. So there's some sort of heredity involved, but also deep insecurity. And the complaints when I've been reading the materials from the 18-teens and in the 1820s during the revolution, the complaint in those days is not about religious or national persecution. It's simply about anasaya, insecurity, insecurity. I want to know that when I make this money, when I exploit my peasants and I make all of this money and I get all of these privileges, I want them to become rights. I want to know that this will be with me and I can give them to my children. You know, after all, hereditary is your immortality, right? Your life after life. And this is the complaint. This is the complaint. So you could say, all right, you have an old regime. There's deep poverty, deep exploitation, arbitrariness, inequality. This is all familiar in any old regime. But the question is, what would make people think that things could be different? What changes, in other words, to make them believe that it doesn't have to continue this way? Any revolution is predicated not so much on the fact of poverty or on the fact of oppression. It's predicated on the belief that things might be better. Expectations, in other words. I didn't come up with this. This is Tocqueville, right? The classic study of the French Revolution. It's not that the French were suffering deeply and objectively and materially. It's that they thought this suffering might end if they had something better. So what changes in this region to make them believe that things might be better? That the Sultan might be overthrown and the Ottoman Empire might be ended, right? And so this brings us to the next stage, which is the arrival of France in 1797 in the Ionian Islands. Napoleon Bonaparte had invaded and destroyed the Venetian Empire. The Ionian Islands had been part of the Venetian Empire. These now become départements of France, 3 départements of France. So what they're introducing is not simply conquest and the French army. What they're introducing is the French Revolution. They're introducing a revolution. It's conquest by revolution. So the local population, overnight like that, is made into equal universal citizens for all men. Overnight, for the first time. Now, this is destructive to the local structure because the local structure is based on the gentry and then everybody else, the second class. There's no third estate, it's just 2 estates, meaning all of the population and then the gentry, the nobility. And the French arrived, destroyed the system, burned the books of the nobility, and declared that now everybody is equal and have the right to participate in politics, right, overnight. So it's tumultuous. What happens then? It basically introduces mini civil wars on each of the 7 Ionian Islands, basically, which will then become worse in the next stage when the Russians arrive. But it's basically a mini civil war. Think of the Vendée. The Vendée is the right way to look at this, with a revolutionary attack and a reactionary counterattack, mini civil wars. But we might obscure at the same time that what the French are introducing and what the later powers are going to introduce as well is also elements of the modern state for the first time, the modern centralized state of mass mobilization, and they do mass mobilize. Anything they're doing and anything the next powers are going to do are based on mass mobilization. And remember also that the French in those days, what made them radical is that they promised, the revolutionaries promised, what was radical in those days was to protect private property and make it equal for everybody. I mean, that was what was revolutionary. So even though they weren't able to achieve it, this is what they were promising the local population, the guarantee of the protection of your person and your property, which is the same thing, your person and your property, so that you can go about your business in security. Now, it's going to take some violence because it's a revolution, but the outcome is supposed to be a regime which does something which the Ottoman regime is never able to do, which is to secure your person and your property. Right. So that's lesson number one. And remember, the Ionian Islands are just a little bit across the sea. You know, sometimes an hour away. Sometimes you can go on foot when the land is higher. To places like Lefkada, or one day to go to half a day to go to Corfu or to Zante or to Kythera. So these are, and the Venetians also had possessions on the land, and this is a showcase of the modern state. Right? The modern state of centralization, mass mobilization, individual rights, with or without democracy. Democracy is secondary. But first, you secure the constitutional order. Then you start thinking about rights and political participation. But the rights you are insisting on, and what the whole French Revolution was all about, was universal rights to person and property. Well, the French were only there for about a year and a half, because then, for various reasons, geopolitical, all of the European powers and the Ottomans decided that the French had gone too far. It invaded the Ionian Islands. They were attacking Egypt. The campaign in Egypt, they were taking Malta, and there's talk that they're going to use these as bases to begin to invade the Ottoman Empire and retrace the roots of Alexander the Great, which in fact they were doing. They were reading the histories of Alexander the Great to figure out what route they're going to take to get to India, but between themselves and India, there's the Ottoman Empire and Persia. Right? So, you know, the Ottomans are feeling insecure, right? Understandably. So they strike an alliance with the British in Egypt, and there's a campaign on the Nile. And then they strike an alliance, very rare, between Russia and the Ottoman Empire to eject the French from the Ionian Islands. This is the only time the Ottomans and the Russians will be on the same side. Right? It's not going to happen again, ever, really. Right? Well, not even today. Not even, yeah. But they do strike an alliance for this purpose, because the Ottomans are also worried about the revolution. It's not simply the geopolitics, but they understand that the French Revolution is this new thing which would threaten them as well. I mean, they say it. You know, we want to preserve the established order and restore the established order on the Ionian Islands. So the Russian fleet, supported by the Aegean fleet of the Ottomans, begins to invade the islands, beginning with Kythera going all the way up to the top. And the Russians and the Ottomans promised to respect religion in a way that the French didn't always do. The French were more anti-clerical than anything else, but it was easy for the locals to conclude that these are barbaric atheists, right? So they promised they're going to preserve or protect all religions, that Napoleon is the Antichrist, and they're going to protect all religions, evict the French, and restore order and hierarchy. But what kind of hierarchy do they mean? So once the French are gone, and the islands have all been taken, the Russian admiral, Ushakov, declares that he's restoring the nobility, but times have changed. So the nobility now has to be expanded. So that people who have a certain amount of wealth, not just birth, but a certain amount of wealth and or education can now also become the nobility. So it is a nobility, and it is an estate system, but the estate has become so fluid that it's looking like a class. And he promises, again, like the French before, and he promises, we're going to protect sacred property and the individual persons involved. This is his primary goal, to restore order and protect property, private property in particular. Well, again, there's some problems, because in order to invade the islands, he also called on all the local population to rise up against the French, and he created a mass movement. So there was a mass uprising against the French and a mass uprising in defense of the French. So it created, again, these mini civil wars on all of the islands. It became very bad on Kythera, where there's an outright jacquerie, or outright, you know, with the typically the burnings, the beheadings, the massacres. And so Kythera became the model of what might go wrong. But it happened on a miniature scale all across the Ionian Islands. And then the Russian fleet was ordered to go to Italy to continue the campaign against the French, and they left things as they were, and it was a full-scale civil war, until the Russian Emperor, Alexander, took an interest. Now, this is the year 1799. In 1801, Alexander becomes emperor. Alexander is interested in the Enlightenment. He's not completely against the French Revolution. He thinks there are enlightened aspects of the French Revolution, which he's interested in. And he sits with the secret committee, and they all draft these constitutions about what might be for Russia, what kind of constitution, what kind of ideas we're going to take from the Enlightenment. And his first experiment, practical experiment, what might we do for Poland? Give Poland a constitution under the Russian crown. But the first practical experiment of this Glasny Komitet, the secret committee, Czartoryski, Vorontsov, these old aristocrats who are all interested in the French Revolution, all interested in the Enlightenment. The first practical experiment they have is the Ionian Islands. And they write a constitution for the Ionian Islands. And then they send it to the Ionian Islands, and they tell them, with now the Russian army returning, tell them that this is your constitution. If you don't like it, you have to leave or go to prison. So take it, right? So we're going to free you whether you want it or not. And we're going to do it this way. And it's this fluid sense of a nobility with voting and participation coming from people of wealth and of status, both of them, meaning a gradual movement toward this fluid universalistic society. And especially guaranteeing private property, especially. The army comes in, they put down all of the uprisings. Those noblemen who refused to go along with it, they exiled. They used the future Russian foreign minister, Kapodistriya, who's from Corfu. He enters into Russian service and he carries out the Russian orders because he agrees with them. We need this sort of moderation, but with some change at the same time. So not purely a restoration. But then the islands are given back to France by the Treaty of Tilsit. Napoleon now returns, but as emperor. He is not interested in democracy any longer, if he ever was, but he is interested in some sort of predictable hierarchy and security of person and security of trade and security of private property. Then the British take the islands. They've taken all of them by 1814, and they come in, and you can guess what they're promising as well. An organized state with proper organs of government, with some local participation, which guarantees first and foremost person and property, right, once again. So you can see the pattern, where these are different regimes. One's a commercial empire, the British. The other one's an administrative bureaucratic empire, a military, the French. The other one's a republic. The other one's an autocracy. But all of them are bringing different models of the same thing, which is the centralized state, which guarantees certain things by force of arms, with or without political participation. As I said, political participation is not the main thing. The main thing is individual rights and order. Main thing. So why am I telling all of this? Because across the sea, these very narrow straits, these powers are recruiting tens of thousands of mainlanders from the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman subjects, and they're teaching them about these things. And in their memoirs, these fighters, people like Kotsonis, people like basically all of the military leaders of the Greek Revolution served some or all of these empires in the course of the Napoleonic Wars. All of them. So obviously they learned fighting. This will be important. They learned about the art of total war, which they'd not experienced before. This will become important. But they're also learning, as they write in their memoirs, they're learning about revolutions, about nations. And they notice something which is true, that the European powers only recruited the Christians. They didn't recruit the Muslims. They only recruited the Christians and gave them privileges. They gave them officers' ranks. They gave them uniforms. They made them citizens in some cases, as in the cases of the Russians and the French. A lot of them ended up staying Russian or staying French. Famous people like Loveldo or Bourbaki, all of these people were islanders recruited by the French. Then people like Kapodistrias were recruited, and he becomes a Russian subject for a spell. And he becomes the Russian foreign minister. And so they're also learning about modern states. And it's admirable from their point of view, and also from the mainland, to see how a modern army can function with its own revenue, with regular pay, with new military tactics. And what a modern state does. Napoleon introduces the secret police on the islands. They introduce public lighting so that you can see what's happening on the dark alleys. They believe it's fighting disease and criminality, both at the same time. They say, no, you cannot throw your slop into the streets. They invite citizens to denounce each other, to practice surveillance on each other. All the elements of a modern, beautiful state, right? So these are what they're learning at the same time. Right? And this is the lesson, this is the contrast, and this is what changes, meaning the belief on the mainland that things might be different because they can see something. They can see this model for the first time right next to themselves. And then it's over, 1815. The armies are demobilized, the Iranian Islands remain British and more stabilized. There's no more competition in the region, not for now. And this is the period of Vienna, the Holy Alliance, the period of, basically the period of, I mean, it is a reaction, right? It's not only a reaction, but it is a reaction. It's the new Europe that's being proclaimed in Vienna under Russian leadership, which is going to be the Europe of a flexible Christian identity, anti-revolutionary, Christian and anti-revolutionary. These are the two main pillars. Order understood, I mean, Ada has written about this, but order understood as with elements that we consider to be liberal. They're willing to experiment with constitutions. They're willing to try different forms of government. It's not a blanket going back to the good old days. But it is a retrenchment, a reaffirmation of certain aspects of what Europe is and isn't. And it's about legitimate government, which usually means monarchy. And it's about Christianity. That's what the Holy Alliance is. To rule by Christian principles because Europe is Christian. And this I'm accenting once again. Europe is Christian. Right. Now, there are a group of people who would be considered by outsiders to be Greek, who are learning to use the terms Greek in the empires. So we're talking about all of the islanders. So for the first time, instead of calling themselves, I'm a nobleman from Corfu, I'm a peasant from Kithira, or that I'm an Orthodox Christian, or I'm a Catholic, some of them were. For the first time, they're given this blanket label. First, the French arrive and call them Grec. The Russians arrive and call them Greki, and the British arrive and call them Greeks, right, for the first time. And they project this label also onto the mainland, although they're never quite sure who they're dealing with, because half of them spoke Albanian, as you know, right? Or they spoke Vlach, or they spoke Turkish, right? But the main thing they're doing is they're conflating this idea that there's a nation, and this nation is Christian and Christian Orthodox, and we're calling this a nation, even though linguistically they're very diverse, and all sorts of other ways they're very diverse. And this idea that there's such thing as a total nation really takes hold in one of the great areas of Greek migration, which is in southern Russia. A huge wave of tens and thousands of people who go to these territories which had just been conquered recently by the Russians from the Ottomans, culminating in the conquest of Crimea. But before that, it was the entire basin, going from the Caucasus on the one side, Caucasus on the one side, to the Danubian principalities on the other. Right? And this whole area of territory has become Russian, and the Russians want to populate it because there's not enough population. And they're particularly fond of the Christians of the Ottoman Empire. Number one, because they're Orthodox. They'll probably be loyal, probably. They're not only taking Greeks, they're taking Mennonite Germans, they're taking Poles, they're taking Jews, and they're bringing all sorts of populations, but a very large group are the Greeks, but the people are calling Greek, precisely because they can do what the Russians cannot do, meaning they can sail on ships and carry the grain from southern Russia to the Western European markets. They can play a role, and they can fight at the same time, because these are ships which are also pirates at the same time. So they come from the Seven Islands, the Iranian Islands. They come from the Aegean Sea. They come from the Anatolian coast. They come from Crete. These mass wave of migrations to the cities like Nizhensk, in what is today Ukraine, Odessa, obviously. All of these new cities have very large populations of Greeks, who are the first time being called Greek. And these Greeks arrive. And whereas if they had been Orthodox in the Ottoman Empire, they have some possibilities. It's not a loss, but it's awkward in the Ottoman Empire because of the disorder and the insecurity. And they're not the top of the administration. They never can be. They have to be Muslim to be the top of the administration. They arrive in Russia, and they're the most privileged. They're giving tax exemptions. They're given land for free. They're given special patents to be able to sail the seas using the Russian flag and have Russian protection. They have the protection of all the network of the consulates of the Russian Empire all through the Mediterranean Sea. And these consuls are themselves Greeks also, most of them. But so were the French consuls and so were the British consuls. But anyway, that's another story. So here, these people who may have been, let's say they were in Italy or they're in France, you know, they're Christian, but they're not Catholic, right? They're not Protestant either. They're not part of the established churches. They're a little peg below. They're Christian, but they're not the top. In the Russian Empire, they're the top. They have more privileges than the vast majority of the Russian population. Of the merchants, peasants, you know, the works, they have more privileges. If they come from a good pedigree, they might be given land as well, like the Ypsilantis. They might be given serfs, which they are. They're doing extremely well. And it's here that certain groups of people, and we know best about certain small groups of the Ypsilanti, of the Sturza, Capodistria, they form these aristocratic groups, which are a way of cultivating the sense of themselves for the first time as Greeks. Right? But it's also happening on a mass scale with the merchants of these port areas. Are you following? Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So it's happening on a mass scale as well. And here they're coming forward as people who now believe that they're something. They're not just anybody, they're something. They're Greeks, right? And the sense of assertiveness and the sense of possibility. And they form the secret society in the city of Odessa at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which is called the Friendly Society, I Filiki Ederia. It's no accident that it happens there, because they're on the Essentia. This is the rising Greek merchant. This is the rising Greek national. And they put forward a proposition. There are lots of secret societies. There have been many conspiracies. They put forward the proposition that there should be a Greek revolution. The Greeks should be liberated, and only they have the right to the territories they consider to be Greek. Only they. And to be Greek is to be Christian. So you can see where this is going. So yeah, as Ottoman subjects, they had a sense of their own, who they are, because that's being raised Ottoman. It's a confessional empire. But what was new and what was learned outside of this area, learned mainly from these empires, was that the nation can be exclusively Christian. That there is a nation and it can be exclusively Christian. And added to this is the whole legal argument that the Ottomans had only ever been conquerors without legal rights to this territory. An argument that was put out quite quickly after the outbreak of the revolution. Now take this conspiracy, the Friendly Society, and contrast it to other conspiracies which are taking place all along the Balkan coast around the same time, in which local notables would make propositions to the imperial powers across the sea in the Iranian Islands and make propositions, inviting the powers to come to evict the Sultan and give them their protection and confirm their rights. But these are conspiracies of Muslims and Christians together. It was happening all along the coasts. You know, they're shopping for better opportunities, right? The French, you know, Napoleon looked very good to them. The Tsar looked very good to them. King George looked very good to them. These were going propositions, so why not switch your loyalties? These are empires, these are not nations, you can switch. But the conspiracies are not of Christians against Muslims, it's of Christians and Muslims against the Sultan. Right? And contrast that to what the Friendly Society was saying. Because they're speaking about total and exclusive nations, which was a new idiom for them. But they're learning it, beginning with the French Revolution, but carried through with all the other empires as well. And that's the Friendly Society. And so I won't go into the details. By now you've probably heard it many times, and maybe too many times. In 1821, they decided they're going to start the revolution, well, basically in the wrong place, the Danubian principalities. I say the wrong place because there's not much of a Greek population there. And the Greeks are not popular there because they're the exploiting class of landowners and tax administrators. So that revolution fails, but it succeeds in the Morea, in the Peloponnese. And here you have to talk about accidents, personalities, because we're talking about the very short term. Before what we're talking about is the longue durée and the conjoncture, but now we have March 1821, when the revolution now takes hold, the events. The revolution takes hold. And here what happens is, the Abbasis, who were still Ottoman subjects and still serving the Ottoman regime, collecting taxes, exploiting the peasants, working, writing in Greek and in Ottoman to their fellow, to the Ayans, are continuing that business, but they also had this possibility, which was introduced by the Friendly Society, of which they are now members, that there might be a revolution too. So this is also an option, but it's not the only option. So in order for this to become the only option, the leaders of the Friendly Society basically lied to them and told them that if you were to rise up right now, the Tsar promises to come to your aid. Russia will come to your aid, which is of course untrue. They knew it was untrue. So they forced their hands. And they said, at these famous meetings, they said, well, okay, if you can show me that the Tsar is actually willing to support us, then we'll join the movement. We'll rise up. And they said, yes, yes, yes. And as soon as they had left, some of the members of the Friendly Society went out and started murdering Muslims in order to force the hand of everybody. Because after they start murdering Muslims, there's going to be reprisals, and the reprisals would be collective. So all of them are now going to be considered guilty collectively. So they have to join, and they join. So what happens in the course of 1821? Basically what happens is that the Muslim population disappears, right, like that. The Muslim population disappears. A lot of them are killed in the warfare. The most famous one would be the massacre of Tripolitsa. Many of them leave altogether. They go to other parts, even though that's where they're from. But by the end of the year, with the fall of Tripolitsa, we're talking about a demographic revolution. It is now a Christian territory, and only a Christian territory. And it was revolutionary in that regard too. It was revolutionary. Because this kind of thing had never happened in the Ottoman Empire. There had been violence, there had been massacres, and it was ubiquitous, but not a statement that one religion is not allowed to be there anymore. The Jews also disappeared because they're considered to be the allies of the Muslims, of the Ottomans. But so far it's not a revolution in the other sense, meaning they've gotten rid of the Ottomans. They're creating local power centers, because Abbasis now set up what they wanted, which was to have the same privileges, but not having to share them with the Ayans, because there's no more Ayans. And they continue to function in many ways the way they had functioned before. Still with these severe regimes of exploitation, without a central state, that's universally recognized. Some of them begin to call themselves pashas and beys. They're still dressed in Ottoman fashion. So it's a revolution, but what many would call still a revolution manquée, because it's missing a real regime change. You know, in some ways, it's still a recognizable old regime. Well, here what happens is a story again, which many people know, or not. A certain faction who did not have a base in the Peloponnese, and this was their problem. They couldn't mobilize resources in the Peloponnese, received loans from British Philhellenes, Byron's gold, right? It was Byron who was the intermediary to give them this. It wasn't a lot, it was about £500,000, but for the local population it was a lot. Enough for them to hire mercenaries from the mainland, all of them experienced in imperial warfare from the Napoleonic Wars, to hire the mercenaries and send them down to the Morea and destroy the power of the notables, which is what they did in what the Greek historiography is called the Greek Civil War, the First Greek Civil War. And so they smashed the power of the notables, and overnight the notables end up in prison. They change their language, so they no longer demand that people kneel before them and lie down before them. They begin to use the term citizen, right, for the first time. They have to come to terms with the new regime. The new regime is universal citizenship, and they have to accept it. And they do, certainly by the end of 1824. And this could have been an outcome, but the problem is the great powers would not recognize the Greek Revolution. Why? Again, Europe was organized against revolutions at this very time. This is the legacy of Vienna, right? Europe is organized against revolutions. When the Greek Revolution broke out, none of the powers wanted to know about it. What were the powers doing themselves at that very time? Well, the French were sending in an army to quash the Spanish Revolution, the 10,000 Sons of St. Louis, right? They're the ones who put down the Spanish Revolution, liberal. The Austrians are putting down the Piedmontese, Neapolitan, and Sicilian revolutions, in the name also of legitimacy and Christian values. The last thing they're going to do is to recognize the Greeks, and they expected that the Sultan would put down this revolution. But the Sultan didn't. Why? It goes back to our original proposition. The Sultan couldn't mobilize men and resources. The people he could mobilize, he sent to put down Ali Pasha in Yanina. That's where the army went. And he had difficulty forming that army. Other parts of the army were fighting a war with Persia. There was no army left. They ran out of armies. So after they finished with Ali Pasha, they sent an army down to put down the Greek Revolution, figuring the Greek Revolution is a small thing in a small peninsula, who cares, it can wait. Well, that army got destroyed. That army got destroyed at the Battle of Venakia, completely annihilated, and guaranteed that there would be no Ottoman presence on this territory unless something changed. So now the European powers have a problem, and it's twofold. One of them is there's a revolution which won't go away. You know, we've done our job. We put down the European revolutions in the Mediterranean. The Sultan is not doing his job. Problem number one. Problem number two is in this entire region of the Eastern Mediterranean, all of these powers depend on shipping. And now it's infested with pirates. So what does Russia export? Russia exports wheat through the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean markets. And their ships can't get through anymore for the Russians. The British, by now it's Pax Britannica. They're in control of the Mediterranean Sea with their fleet, and they're facing piracy as well. And the Iranian Islands can't function as merchant islands any longer, because again, from the pirates. And it's an opportunity. The pirates have come from everywhere, the Barbary Coast, Tunisia, all of the Greek islands, you know, Egypt. But they can't do anything because the Sultan is not doing his job. The Phil-Hellenes in their home countries are demanding action because Christians are being killed by barbaric Muslims, according to their own language. There was this prejudice, you know, across all parts of the Phil-Hellenian movement, which was pro-Christian. I mean, mainly what they're looking at, they thought, was Christians. This is what mattered to them, in other words. Liberals thought so, conservatives like Chateaubriand, he thought so as well. But the Christianity mattered to all of them, all across the board. And to some extent, it mattered to the regimes themselves, to the courts. But they couldn't find a reason to act because action was based on the collective action of the Congress system and of the Holy Alliance. And in this case, Russia, which wanted to adopt a new policy, was also being held back. They wanted to do it mainly for geostrategic reasons. But remember that Vienna, the one pillar is anti-revolutionary, but the other pillar is Christianity. So here they found a pretext. Here we have a Christian people which is fighting for its liberation from an Ottoman regime, which is Muslim. This gives us a pretext. This we can stand on, even though our real reasons are different. Our real reasons are merchant and geostrategic. Russia's ongoing wars with the Ottoman Empire, the French who want to finally enter the Mediterranean area again as an empire. They begin with putting down the Spanish Revolution. That's their first imperial action. The next one will be the Greek Revolution. The third one will be the conquest of Algiers. Right? This triad of interventions, which is to reestablish France as a naval empire and as a regional empire. So Christianity can be an issue. Remember, the King of France at that point is quite conservative, right? And what he does in the name of Christianity, both in Greece and in Algiers. And of course, the 10,000 Sons of St. Louis going into Spain, it's a Christian crusade, right? So what changes actually in Russia again. So Alexander dies in 1825. Nicholas comes to the throne. Nicholas is not fond of the Greeks. Like, he thought they were peasants and shepherds and upstarts. They shouldn't be rising up against the legitimate monarch, but the legitimate monarch is losing legitimacy because he can't keep order. and now our shipping is suffering as well. So he initiates the change. He invites Wellington to St. Petersburg, and they negotiate an agreement, the St. Petersburg Protocol, to say that there's going to be some kind of independent territory here, some kind of independent territory. The French then want to get on board as well, to become, in other words, again, a great power. And they sign the London agreements of the following year. And they agree that there's going to be something Greek, something. And included in all of these agreements is that in order for this territory to be viable, for the state to be viable, it has to be only Christian, which by now made sense to them. So it's already the fait accompli of the Greek Revolution, which is to homogenize the population religiously. The European powers saw this as the fait accompli on the ground, but also assumed that if this is going to be Europe, Europe is Christian. You can't have a European state with a large Muslim population. Right? That's not Europe. So all of this conspires to create this image of this new state, which they also insist has to be non-liberal, where the powers agree. Now, what's happened in the meantime? As I said, the Sultan ran out of armies, so he hired an army. He borrowed an army from Egypt. He got the Egyptian army to come in to put down the Greek Revolution and succeeded. In the process, the Egyptian soldiers, who are basically peasants, fellahin, are being paid with slaves. They're allowed to take slaves from the local population. So this causes an uproar. They're burning, they're looting, raping, and taking masses of slaves. So this causes an uproar in public opinion and also in the courts that this is unacceptable. Furthermore, it's not stabilizing the situation, it's only making it worse. So they send in a fleet to observe, a joint fleet to observe. The British, the French, and the Russians. And that fleet did not obey its orders, and it attacked the Ottoman Egyptian fleet in Avarino and sank the entire fleet. And this more or less set the groundwork for the creation of the Greek state, because there's no more army that can come in to put down the Greek Revolution. That's it. I mean, now even the Egyptians are gone. So they agree again. They're going to send in a French expeditionary force under General Maison, and his job will be to evacuate the remaining Muslims, the Egyptians, but also the indigenous Muslim population that still survived in the forts, who would come back to make sure that this will be a homogeneous Christian population. So they're performing this dual role, which is to complete the demographic revolution, but also secure Greek independence, which they do. Now, they also insisted that this has to be a conservative state in a particular European image. It has to have a king from one of the established royal houses, and they choose Bavaria in the end. Catholic, but you know, what can they do? And in the end decide that this has to be an absolutist state. Now, the Greek revolutionaries at this point are willing to take what they can get. The land is devastated, but at least they got independence and they got a state. There had been a liberal trend in the early stages of the Greek Revolution, but that didn't work. Whenever they spoke about liberalism, the European powers didn't want to hear anything. And the revolutionaries began to change their language into a language of Christianity rather than liberalism. So this creates this confluence. So they're willing to agree that this will be an absolute Christian state. They're willing to agree for the time being, but the liberalism will never quite go away. So there's going to be a period of absolutism. But by 1843, basically for a variety of reasons, but basically the absolute state could not accommodate all the different factions in Greek politics. The different regional, class, linguistic, couldn't accommodate all these variations. And he's basically, there's a coup. It's actually, you can call it the first of the revolutions of 1848, although it was in 1843. I think it's fair to call it that. And they're the ones who introduce a constitutional order. So there will be a king, but a liberal order in which the different factions can speak and be accommodated. Liberalism is a solution, in other words, to intractable problems. It gives, in other words, this possibility. And the other thing that in the end of the Greek Revolution does in some ways intentionally, for some, for others not intentionally. It actually gives the country, it gives a full citizenship to everybody, and individual and property rights. This is no small thing. So revolutions happen sometimes in strange ways, and sometimes in ugly ways, and sometimes with a bit of fanaticism and a lot of bloodshed. But that doesn't make the outcome wrong or bad. So in those days, if you're to talk about universal rights, it happens through the mechanism of the nation state. That's going to be your vessel for delivering it. And this is not just in Greece. Greece begins the process, but it's happened all across Europe, with national revolutions culminating again in the year 1848. Greece is the first example of this. Bloody, messy, sometimes unintentional, as is everything in history, but not a bad outcome. Henceforth, there would be some sense of security, and this would be universalized increasingly, so that a person who has a demand can make the demand, and that person has to be heard. Well, that's the difference between an old regime and a new regime, if you look at it in those terms. And then finally,
yes.
We're fine, right? No, okay. Am I getting too long?
Okay, you can.
Right. And so finally, look at it in the pan-European context. What does the Greek Revolution accomplish? Remember, the Greek Revolution is a European event, not simply in terms of the Enlightenment, but more in terms of it's a pan-European phenomenon. It begins pan-European phenomenon, and Greece is created by the European powers. So what did they create from their point of view? A new boundary of Europe. The geography, a new border, so that Europe is now, from their point of view, expanded to the Aegean Sea and expanded southward through the Balkan Peninsula. This is now part of Europe. It's Christian, and that boundary is demographic as well as geographic. And I see it as part of the process of beginning that debate that we're still having today, which is where is Europe and what is Europe? I mean, not simply what is the geographic boundary, but when we police our geographic boundaries, we also police populations. If there's anything the migrant crisis has been telling us for the past 10 years, is that if you want to defend your boundaries, you're also doing it by allowing some people in and other people not, right? This is something we're still doing today. Should we stop there, Gilles? Are we good?
I think we are.
Okay, all right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fascinating account. So before opening the floor for questions, I would ask Ada to react or comment on research.
Okay, good evening. I would like to thank Conferences d'Athens and Gilles for the invitation to be a correspondent to Professor Kotsonis' presentation. I'm happy for this because I greatly appreciate Yanni's work. Please allow me to speak more generally, have in my mind Yanni's new book published by Alexander Publications. Gilles already referred to this. Okay, anniversaries such as the bicentenary of the Greek Revolution can be and can do many things. Among them are the challenges they offer to the academic community so as to present its research and in particular to present and articulate new research directions and research questions. This is true for Yanni's writings. He fruitfully utilizes a historiographical shift that has taken place for about 2 decades in historical studies, the so-called Imperial term. By doing so, he places the 1821 in wider and multiple contexts. Context is a relational and relative category, which includes, among others, the question of how does a local phenomenon become part of a trend. The imperial term has a family resemblance on one hand with transnational approaches and on the other with local, regional, and even global history. This is something relatively new in the study of history of the Greek Revolution, and it ties with the work of historians of the Ottoman Empire and Mediterranean, a trend which have already produced interesting results. The imperial term means to transcend certain limitations of national history with its methodological claim for the nation as the protagonist of all the historical phenomena. At the same time, it does not ignore the national dimension in the historical narratives. Nevertheless, it rejects what is known as methodological nationalism in historical writing, for it does not presume that the nation is the protagonist of all the phenomena. Within this perspective, nations do not disappear, but their relevant weight changes based on the historical period under scrutiny. In any case, even in the age of revolutions, the nation is not yet the central international actor, contrary to empires which provide us as a heuristic framework for more useful in understanding the revolutions, including the Greek 1821 case. The concept of empire is useful. Why? Yanni has already explained. First, because in those days, big empires such as the British states and Austrian, Russian, and the Ottoman one shaped the entire world with the entangled character of their relations. Empires were complex entities during the whole 18th century and were at the zenith of their influence in parallel with their nemesis, the establishment of the nation state as the preferred model of state building. And as a matter of fact, a large number of Ottoman Greek-speaking people from the elite as well as simple people were subject of these empires. These empires were then a venue of activity for the Greeks, as Yanni and others before him have pointed out, placing certain limits to their activities, but at the same time offering several unique opportunities and prospects, as in the case of economic and social advancement and prosperity. I'm sorry for this.
It's nice.
Okay. People of those days had various mental horizons as to how to act effectively and meaningfully, participate or belong with fluid identities at a time of great disturbances and revolution across the globe. It was a time characterized by more mobility than ever before, which was a crucial parameter in the process of modernization. It is of importance to be aware of the fact that in the meantime, individuals pursued their careers, set up various networks, and created families within a global tapestry. In this prospect, a very interesting aspect of Yanni's work is the biographical perspective. In his book, he tells his stories of people who were on the move before 1821 and who could or would become Greeks. Some of them became heroes of the revolution, such as, for instance, Kotsonis. Others were common everyday people, like the unknown Kotsonis. In other words, he refers to people who had to live their lives in a period of disturbances and contradictions with its contingencies and open possibilities. Through their ordinary or adventure lives, we can understand the multiple ways the global, regional, and local were interconnected. I will stay for a moment in the case of Kotsonis. Yanni, you could say some more on him. For his case, brings forward the aspect of race and the racial question in the Mediterranean, a subject that is understudied. In my opinion, it will be of significance for us today to historicize the racial question if we bear in mind that racism is at the roots of the migration policy today. Here my question is, how could we explain the fact that this Kotsonis choose a French citizenship? For him, as you say, race was not the base criterion. But what about the issue of race at the time in the French state? As we know, Free people of color have certain rights, but did not enjoy the same liberties as their white counterparts. And this Scioli, he chose to be a foreign citizen, a people of color, a person of color. This is a question. The story of these ordinary people, such as Scioli, includes personal choices, and at the same time, the constraints of this era reveals that the fact that for the historical actors, the perspective of being Greeks, of an independent state, the Greek state, was not given. At this point, could you elaborate a little bit more on the question whether the nation is a binding framework for the study of the revolution or simply one of make social phenomena? Or to put on your words, what does it mean to chart a crooked line from empire to nation? And furthermore, what makes some tropes and discourses imperial or national? Instead of comparing the structure of empires and the nations, maybe it's better to compare effects, patterns, and the technologies of rule, political rationalities, such as the practice of displacement or killing or violence and so on. A second point that I want to refer to is religion. Religion, even in the era of revolution, continued to be a very important factor in defining or redefining, thinking or rethinking the political communities across the Mediterranean. And of course, the Greek revolutionaries had every reason to put forward the religious and cultural aspect of their uprising. However, invoking religion did not imply putting aside liberal goals and the need for reforms and progress, as it seems to me that you imply in your book. At this point, I want to make a further comment regarding the role of religion in 1821. It involves 2 points. First, the concept of reform and how this concept refers to the concept of revolution. And second, it's a cultural dimension as the key to the standard of civilization, which at that time was limited to European states. After all, the very idea of Europe as the most advanced civilization of the world at that period was based on the transformed old idea of Christianity. And this idea was common to conservatives and liberals alike, and even to the radicals. And it would be of interest to compare the various Mediterranean uprisings with the uses and interpretation of Christianity and religion. On this subject, Mauricio Isabella has pointed out that the problem during the revolutionary era was not the clash between church religion and state secularism, but within a religious field between those in favor of change and those against it. In other words, the idea of political emancipation, independently from religion, represented only one of the possible options available to rethink the political order, and by no means the dominant one. Even conservative thinkers, such as Alexander Sturza, to take an example from the Russian Empire, the close friend and colleague of Capodistria, used the concept of toleration, terpimos in Russia to prove and to reinforce his orthodox reformism. He was not a revolutionary, but he was a reformer. In the confines of the Orthodox Enlightenment culture, some clerics, such as the eminent Philaret of Moscow, an intellectual and political actor of the time, were proponents of reformism based on religion. Philaret argued, for example, that due to orthodoxy and its spirits of freedom, the Russians have a legal right to civil liberties. Capodistria was not in the inner cycle of Philaret, but he also, like the liberal-minded intellectual of his Russian political cycle, considered religion as the basis for Greek and Russian national identity. Even more, he considered religion as the fundamental reason for pursuing international politics and for expressing society's activism, such as humanitarian aid for the Balkan people, and especially for the Greeks in their war of independence. And as we know, the Russians empathized with the Greek rebels who shared with them the Orthodox faith. Facing few censorship barriers on the matter, discussion of the Greek events freely unfolded, and Philhellenism cut across social lines, embracing not only the elites, but also the simple people through sermons at the churches. Finally, I would to stand for a moment in the present, namely today. It is often said that politicians start revolutions and historians complete them with the interpretative skin they attach to them, because some histories are forgotten and others are silenced. Forgotten or silenced is the story you present in your book, the story that took place merely 15 years before 1821, when a group of Peloponnese notables in the area of Gastuni and Lala conspired to overthrow the Sultan. The Greek notables Yorgos Isinis worked with the Muslim Mali Aga, nicknamed Pharmaki. May I ask what will be the relevance of such stories to the present reader who is immersed in several historical, even often contradictory views, such as, for example, that 1821 was an exceptional event, or on the contrary, that it was a uniquely European liberal success story. However, today, 200 years after those events, the anniversary of the revolution finds the institution of citizenship at the crossroads, at a critical juncture, determined by the acute phenomenon of migration and the fact that the migrants, as well as refugees, face not only harsh frontier barriers, but also the limited possibility of acquiring citizenship, not only in Greece, but in the whole Europe. This is what I had to say for now.